Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Luni Masuku, and I'm the director of the RUSI Nairobi office. I am very pleased that you're joining us today for the panel discussion, What Role is There for Media Development in Preventing and Countering Violent Extremism? Observations from the Strive2 program in Kenya. So I've had the pleasure of being able to call myself the Strive2 team leader for the final months of the program. In this capacity, I will be chairing today's event. Before I introduce the panelists, I'd like to share a few details about RUSI Nairobi, and Strive2, the CVE program, rather the Countering Violent Extremism program, which is supporting today's event, as well as a couple of other RUSI Nairobi team is working on. To start with, RUSI is a UK-based defense and security policy think tank. RUSI's research areas run the gamut from terrorism and conflict to anti-money laundering and illicit wildlife trafficking to military science. RUSI Nairobi was incorporated in 2014 in order to support the European Union funded Strengthening Resilience to Violent Extremism Horn of Africa program, a CVE pilot program in Somaliland and Puntland that helped build the knowledge base for the EU in CVE programming in the Horn of Africa. In addition to Strive Horn of Africa and Strive2, RUSI Nairobi has worked on a number of CVE research and implementation projects in the Horn of Africa for a variety of organizations and continues to focus on CVE work in the region. Namely, we're currently at work on the CVE workstream of the Reinvent program. This is a Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office funded program aimed at reducing insecurity and violent extremism in northern and coastal Kenya, in which we're working in a consortium with Tetra Tech and the Danish Demining Group. We are also at work on a project funded by the Netherlands Embassy in Nairobi with the focus on a student-led countering violent extremism program in 4 Kenyan universities, among other projects. So a little bit about Strive in order to put the today's panel discussion into context. Strive Horn of Africa was the European Union's first CVE program funded outside of Europe. It was from this pilot program that the Strive2 program emerged. With the pilot, the EU funding, the RUSI Nairobi team was able to gain a better understanding of some of the enabling and structural factors involved in facilitating radicalization and the recruitment process of at-risk youth to violent extremist ideologies. The RUSI Nairobi team then developed a program, Strive2, around 4 key components: the mentorship of at-risk youth, support to law enforcement and security actors, research, and finally communication. Today's conversation will focus on the preventive communication component of the Strive2 program in the broader context of peace journalism and media development within countering violent extremism programs and seeing journalists as agents of peace. The preventive communications component was managed by Matt Freer, who is one of today's panelists. Without sort of taking too much of Matt's steam, because he will be discussing this when he has his opportunity to speak, I do want to mention that the Strive2 preventive communications component was piloted around 2 parts. The first of which was focused on media capacity building, and the second focused on youth storytelling. In the media capacity building aspect of the preventive communications component, the goal was to address the Kenyan media from a structural perspective, seeking to train radio journalists in Mombasa, Kenya, and work directly with them to understand concepts around conflict-sensitive journalism, using a modified conflict-sensitive journalism syllabus, and to produce feature stories and other pieces around issues of violent extremism in mainstream Kenyan media. An additional aspect of this training for journalists also included experienced Kenyan journalists that helped mentor journalists that received this training. With the second component focused on the youth storytelling, the aim was to strengthen the capacity of urban marginalized youth's ability to develop and tell their own stories using social media and smartphones. Of course, Matt will speak more to this as well as to the monitoring and evaluation approach to the preventive communications component. So using the preventive communications component of Strive2 as a launching point, please allow me to introduce our panelists. They'll make their opening remarks, exploring the wider aspects of media development and capacity building. And then, of course, we will begin a Q&A with your participation. Please feel free to use the Q&A function when submitting your questions. As a note, just before we begin, this is a public event. So if for any reason you want to remain anonymous with regard to your question, please indicate that in the Q&A box when you submit your question. So now that you know a little bit more about RUSI Nairobi, as well as the EU-funded Strive 2 program, let's move on to our panelists. I first want to introduce Professor Jake Lynch. Professor Lynch is a Leverhulme visiting professor at the Center for Trust, Peace and Social Relations, and is based at the University of Sydney in Australia. He took up an academic post after a long career in journalism, which included a posting as a political correspondent for Sky News and as a presenter for BBC World. Professor Lynch has also developed and conducted training courses in many countries for professional editors and reporters with a focus on peace journalism, a concept that he and Annabelle McGoldrick describe as the process wherein editors and reporters make choices of what stories to report and how to report them that create opportunities for society at large to consider and value nonviolent responses to conflict. Over to you, Professor Lynch.
Thank you, Lunia. Yes, is this my presentation then?
Yes.
Okay, right. I thought I was going second, but that's absolutely fine. Yes, welcome everybody, and thank you for coming. I'll talk a little bit about peace journalism. Peace journalism essentially is a set of distinctions in the representation of conflict relevant to journalism, of course. It's originally an idea coined by Johann Galtung, who is one of the main ideas givers of peace research. And its theoretical antecedent is an essay that he published back in 1965, so it's exactly the same age as me, with a colleague, Mary Holmberg, which is called The Structure of Foreign News. And its impact on the scholarly study of journalism was essentially to help tilt the emphasis away from the individual journalist in the attribution of influence on news content and more towards the structures within which the journalism is produced. And therefore, it highlights a set of what are called in the essay tuning factors. They use as a metaphor a kind of old-fashioned valve radio, so what signals are likely to be tuned into. These tuning factors predicate a set of news values, which in turn manifest themselves as an identifiable set of conventions in the representation of conflict. So one of the predominant conventions, for example, is that a conflict is commonly presented in terms of its violent effects, typically as a kind of series of big bangs. And that corresponds with the economic structure of the news industry. Galtung and Ruger did their research on daily newspapers, an absolutely dominant form of media then, of course, and still very important now. And of course, what prompts the reader to want to buy today's edition of the newspaper? Well, it's because they're going to be told what's happened since they bought yesterday's. So there's a premium on events with a clear beginning, middle, and end, all of which occur in the interval between deadlines. And that emphasizes the violent events as the apparent narrative thread for presenting a conflict. A second one is concentration on elite sources, the words and deeds of identifiable leaders, not terribly interested in delving below that level to find out what's going on elsewhere in the society affected by the conflict. And another notable one of these tuning factors or conventions is a focus on negativity. So as they say in the essay, if you have a 4-factor news communication model, the most newsworthy story is a negative event that befalls elite individuals in elite countries. The least newsworthy story is a positive process that benefits non-elite people in non-elite countries. So that's really a commentary on the source material they used at the time, which is daily newspapers in wealthy Western countries. there's a kind of iron law of media, which is that most news comes from the places where there is most resource to produce it, and then it kind of flows out across the rest of the world. So their findings were highly influential in their time, and I think still salient now. The point is that these conventions identified originally in the Galtung-Ruger essay were later by Galtung called war journalism. So the mainstream of reporting of conflict is identified as war journalism, not merely in the sense of war reporting, that is to say, reporters covering wars, but journalism which in various ways, and whether wittingly or probably usually unwittingly, is likely to leave its readers and audiences to infer that more violence is the inevitable, logical, even desirable next step in the narrative of conflict with which they are being presented. So if war journalism is a problem, and it's a component of broader problems of conflict, unresolved conflict, then there has to be a remedy, and the remedy was peace journalism. So peace journalism is this set of distinctions in the representation of conflict, and it calls on journalists to do things like look further into the backgrounds and contexts, to find causes for the identifiable behavior of conflict actors, and perhaps exits from the situation in which they find themselves across a much broader canvas. It's really based on the insight that conflict is far from a synonym of violence. Conflict is a set of relations which is being reproduced in relationships across the broad conflict formation all the time at all levels. Yes, there is a very big problem with sort of incidents of violence, incidents of direct violence. That's a visible symptom of conflict, and it's a problem in itself, but there are other forms of violence incident upon that conflict as well, structural and cultural violence. One of the good things about this is that it opens up a much broader range of opportunities to intervene decisively to alter the course of a conflict. So anybody at any level, including sub-elite levels, who is working on these issues of direct structural and cultural violence can be construed and understood as a peacemaker, and their work can be understood as peace work. So one of the things that peace journalism calls for is for those efforts and those initiatives to be more prominent in news about conflict. Another one is, which logically goes with it, is to inquire into the contradictions at the heart of the conflict, which are often very difficult to get at. If you call to mind Galtung's kind of classic ABC triangle of conflict, attitudes, behaviors, and contradictions, quite often the behavior of parties to conflict hardens attitudes and makes it much more difficult to get at the contradictions. People very familiarly say, we don't talk to terrorists. But at some stage, at some level, as countless instances prove, you've got to talk to terrorists somehow in order to reach out and close your hand over the underlying issues if the conflict is going to be moved into a new and less violent phase. Countless examples to go with that. So, okay, we have this peace journalism model, whoopee-doos, it has no kind of internal life of its own, or if you wanted in academese, it came with no accompanying social ontology. It was just a kind of list of points on a single side of A4. So some of us have spent the ensuing kind of 25 years, I'm now slightly abashed to discover, trying to breathe life into it and trying to figure out how it works, whether it works, who does it, how can it be done, how can there be more of it. So I should say that peace journalism, therefore, has been the organizing principle both for programs of scholarly research and for initiatives of media development aid. And this is where we approach our subject matter for today. And they have often tried, at least, to proceed in parallel and to inform each other. So I'm going to make an attempt now to do something technical, which is to share my screen. And I'm going to try to find one PowerPoint slide. And I'm hopefully not going to have to resort to any more than just the one. Yeah, here it is. And it's this one. There we are. So in it, I adduce, I think, a very simple but nonetheless quite useful heuristic by Alan Davis of the Institute of War and Peace Reporting, setting out the principles for the monitoring and evaluation of journalist training. In this case, of course, peace journalism training, as per the picture, that's from the Philippines. And he identifies 3 stages for any kind of M&E approach, namely the benefit transferred, the benefit applied, and the benefit beyond. And these have really corresponded with some of the chief research questions in peace journalism research. So by the benefit transferred, he means the manifest content of a training program, what's written in the manual, what's given to the journalists. So far, so straightforward, you may think. The other 2 are the problematical ones, the benefit applied and the benefit beyond. And they're so problematical, as it turns out, that research has really tackled them in reverse order. The benefit beyond is really what can be said about the wider influence or the wider impact on the symbolic environment in which the conflict is being mediated and responded to of something like peace journalism training. So if reporters and editors attend a training event, a purposive activity, if you will, and as a result of that, they find that they are equipped with ideas and new approaches that they can begin applying in their journalism, and they start to produce new kinds of journalism. They start to represent conflict in the ways called for in the peace journalism model. How do we know that makes any difference when it goes to readers and audiences? What is the influence on the meanings that people will make out of it? As in the definition that Lunia read out earlier, peace journalism is about what readers and audiences do with this stuff. It's never been just about the kind of content of journalism. It's all about the implicit content, how it fits in with the kind of meaning structures in the conflict-affected society. So there has been quite a bit of research, including some that I've done about that. And in the one I did, we kind of operated in 4 countries, Australia, the Philippines, South Africa, and Mexico. We partnered with television news operations in each country to produce material, research material, which was structured as a peace journalism bulletin and a war journalism bulletin, all dealing with familiar stories from the local news agenda. And we played those to different groups, and we tried to figure out what are the interactions, namely what difference does it make in the meanings that people construct in response to what they're watching. And yes, reassuringly, we found it does make a difference. So in other words, there is some research evidence, at least, not a huge amount, but some, to suggest that if there was more peace journalism in the media, people would be more receptive to initiatives and suggestions for peace. They would consider and value non-violent responses to a rather greater extent than they might otherwise. So in terms of the benefit beyond, there is at least a little bit of supporting evidence that has been provided by research. Benefit applied is a tricky one. I'm sorry I'm going to take issue with some of your opening remarks, Lunia, but I've read the account of the Strive 2 program and the work with journalists. It's great stuff. I might be tempted to allocate it under a heading of agency rather than structure. And that's where I take issue with you, okay? Because I think it's mentioned in the paper by Matt and colleagues that I've read that the journalists, had to go back to a bunch of radio stations, controlled by people who had no necessary incentive to promote peace journalism or provide for their journalists to do more peace journalism than they did before. So this is a problem because, and there's a paradox. A paradox lurks within the peace journalism model because the essay I've mentioned, the Galtung-Ruger essay, The Structure of Foreign News, as I said, it tilted the emphasis, or it helped to tilt the emphasis in journalism research. Before that, influences on news content tended to be attributed chiefly to the preferences of individual journalists. The gatekeeper model was prevalent in contemporary research, for example, but the Galtung-Ruger essay helped to tilt the focus away to the structures within which journalism is produced. So therefore, the paradox is that peace journalism, while it is a kind of distant descendant of the Galtung-Ruger essay, has usually been promoted by attempting to liberate journalistic agency and not doing anything about these structures. There are examples where it has, but they're relatively few and far between. And of course, a journalism training program as an intervention in media development aid can only do that. And one of my contemporaries, Fiona Lloyd, who was doing this kind of training roughly at the same time as me, nearly 20 years ago in Indonesia, I think put her finger on it, saying that there's a danger in this kind of activity of setting up cycles of empowerment and disempowerment. So trainees return to the kind of cold, hard realities of the office and find that for all the excitement they felt of the ideas they explored in the training course, they can't actually carry them out to any greater extent than they did before. So that's a real problem for journalistic research, it seems to me, or for peace journalism research. And just to give you a little glimpse before I finish and avoid taking up everyone's time, of a little bit of research that we've begun to do about this. This is going to be a double-page spread from a journal, a magazine, a biannual magazine called The Peace Journalist, there it is, which is put out by the Park University Global Peace Journalism Centre. And this is about a kind of pilot study that I've done with a colleague, Juliana Tirapelli from De Montfort University, on a small group, 12 alumni of a university course that I've taught for the last 20 years called Conflict Resolving Media. And while it is a university course, and of course it's getting students to kind of reflect critically on issues foregrounded by, conflict practice, etc. It's nonetheless closely based in its structure and content on a lot of the training courses that I've developed and facilitated over the years in professional settings, and therefore we chose for the pilot study participants who were 12 alumni of this course who had gone on to do roles, professional roles in media and communication. And we asked them whether and to what extent they were in their work able to apply the lessons from peace journalism. And to some extent they could, some bits of the model more easy to apply than others, but we can begin to say, at least with reference to evidence from relevant research, that if you do peace journalism training as an initiative in media development aid in a conflict-affected society, the journalist participants can apply those ideas to some extent. And if and when they do, then it does, at least to some extent, lead or leave audiences to make slightly different meanings in response to conflict, such that the overall symbolic environment in which it is being waged becomes somewhat more propitious to peace and leads them to consider and value non-violent responses. So that's all very kind of tentative and vociferous, but it's probably enough to show that we are onto something in regard to using peace journalism in that kind of way, and so it's a kind of promising further avenue to explore. So I'll be quiet for now and look forward to listening to my colleagues. Thank you, Lumiere. Back to you.
There we go. Thank you so much, Professor Lynch. I know that we're going to have a good Q&A, that you're already pushing back against some of the comments that I've made. I'm looking forward to the Q&A. I'd now like to introduce our next panelist, James Dean. James has a long history of work in media development, and he is currently serving as the head of policy at BBC Media Action, where he's been since 2007. James calls on a background focused on the role of media and access to information in development, having commissioned and written numerous briefings on media in fragile states to include Afghanistan, Somalia, Iraq, just to mention a few, as well as on uprisings and other conflicts for organizations such as NATO, among others. James also has participated in research partnerships focused on conflict, crime, security, and lessons learned with regard to media and conflict-affected and fragile states. He's done research on an integrated approach that seeks feedback from the audience on what can and should inform the work, thinking, and practice of journalists. Over to you, James.
Thank you very much, and I'm going to just share my slide too, if that works. So I'm hoping you can see that. So what I thought I would do is to just tell a bit of a story, really, through the lens of BBC Media Action, of how this whole issue of media development and violent extremism, and particularly the kind of connections and tensions between media development and strategic communication are kind of played out over the last few years. So first of all, just let me talk a little bit about BBC Media Action. So I'm here, just be clear, I'm talking here about Media Action, which is the charity of the BBC, not the BBC itself. We support independent media essential to democracy and development. We have a very strong focus on audience research and responding to people's information and communication needs, and a lot of this presentation is rooted on about that. We reach with our partners, some of it with the BBC, but principally through domestic, national, local partners, about 100 million people around the world every year. As I said, we do a lot of research, and way back in 2012, we published this report, The Media of Afghanistan, The Challenges of Transition. We had quite a big operation in Afghanistan, been working there since 2004, 2005, and actually been supporting media there for a lot longer. And this report was really looking at what the state of the media sector. It was effectively a kind of political economy analysis, really, of the media in the context of a transition. And it came up with a bunch of recommendations, and for example, one of the recommendations was, which is effectively a media development recommendation, it's kind of what media development is to help to build a plural media by supporting institutions and initiatives that have proved their worth for the Afghan public domain. And it said, with military transition and the prospect of reduced Western funding, strategic support for such institutions, for Afghan media institutions, and program initiatives will become more important if a public domain is not to become influenced disproportionately by warlord and ethnic media. We said support local radio stations at a level that can be sustained, because what we were arguing is that there are currently more local radio stations than the market can support sustainably. Many local radio stations have become dependent on windfalls from ISAF and from the provincial reconstruction teams in the country, and internationally supported advertising campaigns, and will be vulnerable to any sudden reduction of support. If local radio is to survive and to serve as a voice of its communities, it needs to be reoriented to local needs and run according to community priorities. And finally, review the role and impact of ISAF-run media operations and transferring some of these to Afghan ownership as part of a transition process in a sensitive way. And we said ISAF runs a fortnightly national newspaper and approximately 100 small radio stations across the country, many of them operating within provincial reconstruction teams. Yet the impact of this large operation on Afghan public opinion has been very limited. We recommend that ISAF hold discussions with the government of Afghanistan on the future of these media operations in the post-transition period. So that was kind of an analysis that we were doing back in 2012 in Afghanistan on the kind of future of the media and how that connected with some of the kind of insurgency operated issues. And when we published that, we talked to ISAF before publication, and we talked particularly to ISAF after publication. And slightly to our surprise, ISAF were coming to very similar sets of conclusions themselves. And I should say that this document was an unclassified draft, which they shared with us happily. It was never, as far as I know, actually completed, so this was never ISAF policy. But it does provide a really interesting insight into how ISAF itself were thinking at the time. And they were basically arguing that, their whole strategic communication operation was trying to persuade citizens to choose, to make a choice effectively, well, between what they call two bads: the bad of a corrupt public system and the deadly threat posed by insurgents. And what this draft suggested was that ISAF's proposed civil society engagement strategy should be founded on the following principles. Seek first to understand Afghan civil society and act in support of their plans, rather than provide our solutions for their issues. The Afghan people are the best source of solutions to problems in Afghanistan. We need to build authentic relationships with Afghan people, don't merely message or target them. Empower Afghan civil society leaders through listening, bridge the trust gap of becoming a consistent and credible partner. Realize that everything ISAF does affects the Afghan people, yet if ISAF is unable to respect and recognize common views of Afghans in plans, operations, and communications, then the effects will be misunderstood, misinterpreted, and generally counter to sustainable, positive outcomes. So when we talked to them, we realized that actually a lot of what we were trying to achieve through media development, build trusted relationships with people, create platforms for public debate, create platforms for people's grievances to be aired, were pretty well what ISAF was also trying to achieve. And yet there was zero communication, and there was absolutely a complete absence of any kind of mechanism in the country to not bring together, because that would have been counterproductive, but at least to have some kind of connection and lesson learning between these two sets of discourse. Later on, we produced this, very shortly after this, actually, we started this program called Open Jirga. By the way, in relation to Jake's arguments, we very rarely do standalone training. An awful lot of our training is integrated into actual program production, so that the training actually does lead to a realization of how people can actually apply their skills in practice. This program reached, at its height, reached about a quarter of the Afghan population, and is still going on. And effectively, it is putting senior Afghan politicians and other leaders, and sometimes presidents, in front of ordinary people so that they can air their grievances. And this is one of many programs focused on accountability and dialogue. And Afghanistan is just one example of how this debate, I think, is being played out. So we produced other policy briefings, as Lunia said, on Kenya, on Afghanistan, on Iraq, Somalia, Pakistan, Nepal, and many others, and done quite a lot of work on how media actually is playing out in these areas. And all this work seemed to increasingly raise the question is actually what is, in the context of violent extremism, what are the strategies that are actually working when it comes to information and communication and media? And I joined a group which was set up by the British UK Research Council called the Partnership on Conflict, Crime and Security, and asked a lot of the academics who sat on that, said, what do you know about the evidence base supporting an awful lot of the work that is being funded at the moment to use communication to counter violent extremism? And the more I looked at it, the more I couldn't find the evidence that underpinned this work. And so that led to PAX commissioning this report by Kate Ferguson, which I think many of you will know about, which basically concluded on the review of the evidence for lack of evidence that counter-narrative strategies are effective at reducing the violent extremism threat. Trying to dismantle a narrative doesn't address why that narrative is appealing in the first place. Alternative approaches, like many media development approaches, have greater evidence. Trust is crucial. We need to address the root causes of tension and division in society. Projects that are most successful aim to facilitate conversation, aim to encourage awareness, and dispel misinformation. And fundamentally, the theory that the messages, myths, promises, objectives, glamour, and other enticements propagated via violent extremist narratives can be replaced with or dismantled by an alternative set of communications is an assumption that remains unproven. And when Kate finished this report, and I worked with her quite a lot on the kind of dissemination around it, we made presentations to NATO, to various bits of UK government, other governments, including the US, to UNDP and their Preventing Violent Extremism strategy. And much to our surprise, no one actually disagreed with this assessment. We find it very difficult to find people who actually said, no, you're wrong. There is lots of evidence. You're not finding it. Some places we went to, where it was remarkably common refrain. This is not from all the places I've just mentioned, but a lot of people said, actually, we kind of know you're right, but we need to be seen to be doing something. And an awful lot of the strategic communication strategies are based on being seen to be doing something rather than actually effectively responding. This has fed into lots of different things. I know RUSI's been obviously done a huge amount of work on this itself, including a British Council report, which I won't go through in detail for time reasons, but basically came up with sort of similar sets of conclusions. Recent communication work is focused on opening rather than winning hearts and minds and building the connections we associate with resilient communities. And it's the same kind of echoing themes as actually going right back to that ISAF report. So I'll finish with this slide for the sake of time, but I think there's such a lot to do in this area. And so I thought I'd just kind of summarize some challenges and opportunities of how to connect up a media development with strategic communication debate. So media development, as Kate Ferguson found, does have very strong evidence that it impacts on many drivers of violent extremism: corruption, lack of accountability, social cohesion. Many of the drivers of violence, we've got good evidence to suggest that actually there is an effect on these. But we don't actually have very much evidence that anything that media development does actually reduces violent extremism. So this is kind of quite a big unanswered question. So there is a need for more evidence-based debate and evidence-based strategies across the piece. And this is our dilemma, is that as a media development organization which exists to support democracy and public debate within a country, the more what we do is framed as directly tackling violent extremism, the less likely it is to actually be effective, because it won't necessarily be trusted. And I know this is an issue that Matt's been talking a lot about. But it is possible, I think, to have a more productive lesson learned and dialogue between strategic communication and media development efforts, including at a national level, but not to the extent that they're joined. Because if they're joined, they won't, again, they will lose credibility, they'll lose trust. And if they're subsumed into a single strategy, they'll almost certainly fail. But whatever happens, we need to listen to an audience and people, because I'm absolutely convinced that no strategy in this space will work. And that's why 10% of our budget, of our project budgets, are focused on audience research. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. I really appreciate that you touched on something that I know is going to come up in the Q&A and that Matt will address, which is the evidence base and building on that. So last but not least, we have Matt Freer. Matt has nearly 2 decades of experience in media and communication. He has worked in roles as varied as UK civil servant and government communicator, including stints in Downing Street and the Foreign Office, with postings in Baghdad, Iraq, Kabul, Afghanistan, as well as Washington, DC. And he's also worked as an independent media and communications consultant for strategic communications teams in Somalia, Kenya, and Libya. So Matt likes to call himself a recovering propagandist, perhaps based on some of his past work experiences. In the latter part of his career, Matt's interests have focused on researching and exploring alternative media and communications practices, specifically in response to terrorism and violent extremism. Finally, he's worked on the Strive 2 program since 2016. And just as a note, that program is coming to an end. Over to you, Matt.
Thank you very much, Lunia. Thanks, Jake and James, for your points so far. I'll say a few more words about the details of the Strive 2 program and the media training / capacity building that we carried out, which will sort of give you a bit more flavour of what we did and hopefully relate to some of these bigger points that, that both Jake and James have thrown up. First, about the planning of the training and the build-up. Relating to what James was saying about research, we did our own research in Kenya under the Strive Horn of Africa program, and that looked at how the media were reporting on terrorism. So it looked at analysed coverage, and also spoke to a number of Kenyan journalists and editors in a focus group. And this helped us to understand their needs, the challenges they faced in reporting, but also to try and objectively assess what the media coverage says, and point at issues that Jake referred to around war journalism. And this came out a little bit in the coverage and a little bit out in the focus group discussion, in terms of the overemphasis on some elements of why young people at the coast in Kenya might join a violent extremist group, the framing of terrorism as a binary choice, or as a choice indeed, and as binary, and sort of the us versus them, and the exclusion of individuals and groups who already felt frustrated and marginalized. And also in the lead up to the training, we spoke to radio managers at the coast to try and shape the training so it met their needs. And this told us that they found themselves in quite a bind. They felt oftentimes caught between a government that was concerned about the coverage and the effect of that coverage on publicising terrorist acts, and an audience that was quite thirsty for news and understanding the context. And this, bearing in mind, this sort of started in 2016-17, when tensions at the coast are actually sort of higher than perhaps they are now. And it also threw up the idea that the media perhaps wanted another perspective, an outside perspective, and different knowledge and skills to be able to sort of go into this space on terrorism. And this led to a construction of training, which was not only around training in a classroom, but also mentorship with the journalists that Lunia mentioned, former broadcast and print Kenyan journalists with lots of experience, and the production and broadcast of stories, thereby proving that this sort of content could come to fruition. And really, finally, today's event is also part of that process of sort of sharing lessons and talking about this alternative approach, alternative to the strategic communications that James referred to. And just a quick point about the syllabus, secondly, is that it was designed specifically for the context and the particular local circumstances. And it focused on terrorism. And there aren't many syllabuses for conflict-sensitive journalism that sort of take some of the issues around terrorism head on. So the training did two things. It reinforced basic tenets of good journalism. That's the sort of stuff you would see in any conflict-sensitive journalism syllabus. Accuracy in checking facts, accuracy in framing and contextualizing events, discussing what impartiality meant, and responsibility in the use of language. And this is sort of the capacity, particularly that small stations at the coast were quite wanting. They needed particularly in terms of sort of producing quality radio programs. But it also sought to respond to specific issues around terrorism, and this is something that Jake referred to, the problem of violent events capturing headlines and dominating headlines, and therefore dominating agendas and public sentiment. And it sought to bring out and focus on longer form reporting, program content. So for these small radio stations, perhaps got limited choice, but we decided to focus in two separate rounds of training, first on feature stories, which were a way of probing and looking into issues in a less emotive manner, and where there's more time to find new voices and find new stories, and talk shows, which are, I mean, like James' example from Afghanistan, a good way of engaging the audience, and also, you know, bringing out more angles to a concept than a simple news bulletin. And it also focused on techniques, particularly in bringing in marginalized voices and communities. And I think that was a key part for the context of the Coast, because the research tells us repeatedly that the grievances and the conflict that come out in sense of being economically and politically marginalized is a key driver in violent extremism. And in that syllabus, we talked about terrorism as conflict. And that was very important to the shape of the training, because it helped journalists to look behind quite inflammatory rhetoric that can come out in public statements from many parties to a conflict. And it meant journalists could make the link to the underlying interests and needs, or what Jake's referred to, the ABC triangle, and bring out the voice of different groups, and particularly disenfranchised young people, where we know violent extremism can be a problem. And because this was a prevention program, this use of personal stories, which are quite non-political in nature, allowed perhaps personal issues, cultural issues to emerge that might not otherwise be connected to terrorism in the minds of the audience, or the minds. So, and in the evaluation we carried out, which involved measuring before and after the training, that looked at some of this changes in the agency of journalists, particularly their knowledge of terrorism, skills of conflict-sensitive journalism, and those showed good in Jake's terminology, benefits applied. Those knowledge and skills were transferred, and a focus group with managers reflected that they'd seen some changes in how reporters addressed issues. And an independent evaluation team that's recently presented its findings, and the full report is going to be published soon on the RUSI website. And they interviewed participants from the radio stations and spent time with one particular radio station. And they found that the training was relevant, and it changed reporting on the topic, particularly in terms of the confidence and ability of reporters to cover stories with new angles. So, I mean, perhaps just to round up, because I'm aware we are running a little bit short of time. I mean, I think, talking from the sort of technical level, there is one where we can see that support can be delivered and changes can be evaluated and measures. But as James pointed out, there are tensions with perhaps what donors and what practitioners tend to focus on, which is strategic communications. And one thing I think that came out quite clearly from this exercise was that treating the media as independent professionals, however much you may find problems with or disagree or dislike some of their coverage, is critical. Not subordinating the media to a strategic communications plan, or indeed security objectives, but finding in them a forum and a place for broader dialogue about these sorts of issues, and trying to reflect this, in what's being talked about as the whole of society approach, and trying to bring in voices as themselves and build these authentic relations is quite important. I think I'll just hand it over at that point to questions and answers.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate it. As Matt mentioned, we do have a few moments now for some question and answer session. So we do invite everyone in the audience to please submit your questions using the Q&A function in the chat box there. We've already received one question by Beth that I do want to pose to all of our panelists here, and I would like to start with Professor Lynch. So the question is about identity and how identity in terms of sort of ethnic groups or subgroups that may or may not be represented in media at all in a given conflict situation. And the question is specifically about the role of media with regard to cultural identity and the role that media may play inadvertently in creating more fertile ground for violent extremist recruiters or stoking a given conflict in a given context. So Professor Lynch, I'd like to start with you. James, if you want to come in afterwards, and Matt, if you have anything to add, please do so.
Yes, thanks for that, and thanks for the question. I just typed a brief answer, so I'll kind of expand on it slightly now. In many ways, you know, my kind of peace journalism poster child has been a website in the southern Philippines called Minda News. And it's very successful. It's run by a cooperative. It was started by a group of journalists who resigned en masse from the Davao Bureau of the Philippines Daily Inquirer, which is the country's main newspaper. And what they did was they made a point of engaging in a lengthy process of community consultation, specifically with the view to reaching out to sections of the community who had been generally marginalized and excluded in mainstream media, in order to consult them on what they would want from a community media initiative and how to build their voices into various narratives. In the period since, by the way, one thing they've done to kind of sustain themselves is they've also acted as a news agency whereby other media pick up from them for example, interviews with sources that they wouldn't themselves commonly go to. So they've maintained that footing in the community. And in brief, the people in Mindanao refer to their community as the tri-peoples of Mindanao, Christian, Muslim, and Lumad, who are the indigenous peoples. And if you map the Venn diagram, there's often an overlap between some of those communities and support, for example, for one or both of the two long-running insurgencies that have dogged the southern Philippines, namely by the Communist New People's Army and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, with associated splinter groups. And therefore, there is a sense in which Minda News, as a media development initiative, is providing pathways into mainstream discourse for the perspectives which drive support for those non-state armed groups in those long-running insurgencies. So it brings a little closer the opportunity to engage with the underlying justice issues that sustain those conflicts, and therefore it can be seen as a kind of successful peace journalism initiative. And by the way, it's been successful because it was able to set up its own structure, because the people concerned got fed up trying to kind of shoehorn that content into the existing structure.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Lynch. And James, if you'd like to jump in on this, I'm happy for you to do so, as well as you, Matt. I'd like to ask you to cap your response at maybe 1 minute or so, because we do have a few questions coming in, and I'd love for you all to be able to answer these questions for the audience. Over to you, James.
I want to bring this right up to date. So at the moment, what we're seeing is a kind of massive collapse in independent media around the world. The market model supporting independent media has gone. The worst effects of that are in low-income countries. The COVID and the economic implications of that have kind of turbocharged an existing trend. So what we're seeing is independent media that actually exists to serve a public interest, that exists to reflect people's views, is dying. And what that means is that those democratic media spaces are being increasingly occupied by largely non-democratic media media actors. Some of those are national, in terms of authoritarians. Some of them are factional, whether ethnic, religious, or others, and many of them are international in the shape of China, Russia, or others. This is too big an issue to do in a minute, but fundamentally, most of the structural forces shaping public discourse are fragmenting and fracturing societies. They're also providing really important opportunities for marginalized voices to be heard, often for the first time. but a huge amount of fragmentation, a fracturing of society, and a vulnerability of those media spaces to co-option by the most extreme forces in society are growing very, very quickly. This is going to be, I think, convinced one of the shaping factors of the next decade or two is that information and communication terrain is going to really be shaping an awful lot of our world in the future.
Thank you. Yeah, and just to add on to what James, you said there, I think, I think sort of talking to the sort of CVE agenda, I think that the danger is that CVE has been far too preoccupied with social media and preoccupied with using social media in its strategic communications to essentially slice and dice an audience with targeted messages. Whereas, of course, what we're talking about is diametrically opposite. It's about a shared conversation, it's about a shared space, and it's, to paraphrase what Kate Ferguson talked about, it's an audience to hear people unlike me talking to people like me about, and having that conflict in the open, online, on air. And I think the challenge will be for donors to really get into this, get into social media and think about how that can broaden audiences, not fragment them.
Thank you, appreciate that. To try to get in another couple of questions as we quickly run out of time here. I've got a question from Charles that's specifically speaking about techniques that you use to gain insight as regards the audience. A lot of what you've discussed today talks about listening to the audience and making sure that the work is informed by the audience. What are some of these techniques that you've used to gain insight from the audience? And if we might start with you, Matt, and then we can go to James and then Professor Lynch.
Well, I think in terms of the audience, it's an interesting question because we've been focused on media capacity building. In a way, it's for the media to manage that relationship with the audience and to build that understanding and let the audience set the language. Violent extremism, as has been said so many times, is a distinctly unhelpful turn of phrase for those who it affects the most. We didn't use that. We used causes of terrorism in our training because that felt like that was language that the media themselves said was more important. But I mean, going back to this, the audience research was actually research generally. It was, it was research that the program conducted about the causes of violent extremism and terrorism. And that then enabled us to talk to the media about it. And then they could then have that relationship with the audience. So I think it's about thinking about the audience in a slightly different way.
Yeah, I mean, we do a huge amount of audience research ourselves, both quantitative and qualitative. We did a very big program actually of audience research in Eastern Africa. And it's not just about what they think of the media and who they trust. It's partly who people trust and who people pay attention to. But it's also what issues do they want to see reflected? What do they want to see talked about? When we did the research in Eastern Africa, lack of opportunity for young people, no jobs, frustration and disillusionment with the political system, intergenerational tension, social normalization of violence, huge issue. The commonality of illegal groups, a crisis of identity. And actually one of the things we suggested as a result of all of that was actually a program, which was a drama program, which reflected the brutal reality of people's lives. Because unless you're actually starting with the lived experience of what people see as their lived experience, and then starting from acknowledging that, it seems to us unlikely that you're going to really generate attention and trust. So research and really deep audience research is absolutely fundamental, certainly to everything we're doing.
Okay, and I'd like to give Professor Lynch the last comment on this so that I can, after that, I'll quickly wrap up today.
Yes, I mean, peace journalism is a set of distinctions in representation of conflict. It is only a set of headings. and quite clearly, when you're trying to work with ideational distinctions in particular settings, you need to have an approach to audience research which is informed by critical discourse analysis. That is to say, to try to identify the issues and the kind of meaning structures within which reserves of power are held and stored, and therefore where is the rubber going to hit the road, so to speak, in respect of particular stories. And that is, one of the biggest research issues for peace journalism as a hypothesis, and its salience or relevance to the working lives of journalists and the meaning-making experiences of their readers and audiences in different places.
Thank you for the last word on that, Professor Lynch. Apologies to the audience. We've had many more questions than we've been able to have the time to answer today. So we apologize for that. If at all possible, we will send an email to respond to questions of the audience. So as we run out of time today, I want to very quickly extend a thank you to the panelists that have taken their time to be here today to participate in this very meaningful discussion, as well as to the European Union for funding and supporting the Strive Horn of Africa program, Strive Horn of Africa and Strive 2 programs, and enabling some of the activities that were just discussed today. I'd also like to thank the entire RUSI Nairobi team that worked on the Strive 2 program, as well as the RUSI Communications and Events team, in particular Sabrina Downey for managing today's event. Finally, a big thank you to the audience. Again, there were so many questions that we did not have time to answer all of them, and we appreciate the questions that you've submitted. I'd just like to direct people to the RUSI website, in particular to the RUSI Journal, where you can find work that Matt has recently published called Preventive Communication, Emerging Lessons from Participative Approaches to Countering Violent Extremism in Kenya, where he discusses in more length some of the themes and topics that have come up today. I'd also like to invite you to visit the RUSI website to find more information on the Strive 2 program, as well as other CVE research and programming that RUSI is involved in. So for those of you interested in more research and observations from the European Union funded Strive 2 program that is just ending, as I mentioned, in the next couple of months, please join us this Thursday at 11 a.m. East Africa time, 9 a.m. British Summer Time, for a panel discussion on the Strive 2 commissioned research, tracing the trajectory of a Salafi organization local to Kwale County, Kenya, Ansar al-Sunnah. Again, please visit the website to register for that. And again, thank you so much to the panelists and all of the audience today. I apologize that we didn't have time to have a longer discussion. Thank you for joining us today, and goodbye.